When people witness markets coordinate millions of individual decisions without any central director, they often call it magic. But this seemingly miraculous coordination isn't supernatural. It's the result of a sophisticated information system that humanity has developed over centuries of evolutionary trial and error. The real magic lies not in markets themselves, but in our ability to understand how complex order emerges from simple rules and dispersed knowledge. What appears magical to the untrained eye is actually the product of countless individuals acting on their local knowledge, guided by price signals that communicate information faster and more accurately than any central planning bureau ever could. Today, I want to reveal the elegant mechanics behind this apparent magic, how markets solve the impossible problem of coordinating human action without a coordinator, and why this understanding is crucial for preserving the prosperity that free societies have achieved. The mystery isn't that markets work, it's that we've convinced ourselves they shouldn't. Chapter 1: The knowledge problem that makes markets necessary. The foundation of market coordination rests on a fundamental epistemological reality. No single mind can possess all the knowledge necessary to organize economic activity efficiently. This isn't a temporary limitation that better computers or smarter planners might overcome, it's an inherent feature of how knowledge exists in the world. Knowledge in society exists in two fundamentally different forms. There's scientific knowledge, the kind we can write in textbooks and store in computers, and there's practical knowledge of particular circumstances of time and place. The farmer knows when his soil is ready for planting. The shop owner knows which products her customers prefer. The worker knows the most efficient way to complete his task. This local, contextual knowledge is vast, constantly changing, and impossible to centralize. During my years observing how war economies attempted to replace market mechanisms with central planning, I witnessed firsthand the insurmountable information problems that planners faced. No matter how intelligent or well-intentioned, they simply could not access the millions of bits of local knowledge that market participants use naturally every day. Consider a simple example: the best time to ship goods from Chicago to New York. This depends on weather patterns, traffic conditions, fuel prices, labor availability, customer urgency, alternative transportation options, and dozens of other factors that change hourly. A central planner would need to collect, process, and coordinate all this information from thousands of sources. But a truck driver making this decision uses his local knowledge instantly, guided by price signals that already incorporate all relevant information. The mathematical impossibility becomes clear when we realize that the knowledge problem isn't just about quantity, it's about the nature of knowledge itself. Much practical knowledge cannot be articulated or transmitted. It exists only in the minds of individuals who have acquired it through experience. Markets don't solve the knowledge problem by centralizing information, they solve it by eliminating the need for centralization entirely. This is why markets appear magical to those who believe coordination requires a coordinator. They're witnessing a solution to an information problem that seems logically impossible, until you understand that the solution doesn't require anyone to possess complete information. Chapter 2: Spontaneous Order versus Designed Order. To understand why markets work without central direction, we must distinguish between two fundamentally different types of order: spontaneous order, which I call cosmos, and designed order, which I call taxis. This distinction explains why market coordination appears magical to those who assume all order must be imposed. Designed order is what most people intuitively expect. Someone creates a plan, issues commands, and directs the parts to fulfill specific purposes. Military organizations, manufacturing assembly lines, and government bureaucracies exemplify designed order. The structure serves the designer's conscious purposes. Spontaneous order emerges without central design through the interaction of elements following simple rules. Language evolved this way, no committee designed English, yet it serves millions of speakers' communication needs. Common law developed through accumulated judicial decisions, creating legal principles more sophisticated than any single legislator could design. Cities grow through countless individual decisions about where to live and work, creating complex urban patterns no city planner conceived. Markets represent the most sophisticated form of spontaneous order humans have developed. They coordinate the economic activities of millions without anyone directing the overall pattern. Each participant follows simple rules: respect property rights, honor contracts, seek profitable opportunities, and the result is an ordered system that serves human needs more effectively than any designed alternative. The magic disappears when we understand that spontaneous order doesn't require omniscient planning because it creates its own intelligence. Each market participant contributes their local knowledge to the system. Prices aggregate this dispersed information and communicate it to everyone else. The system becomes collectively smarter than any individual within it. This emergent intelligence explains why market economies consistently outperform planned economies. It's not that market participants are smarter than central planners, it's that markets harness the collective intelligence of all participants, while central planning restricts decision-making to a few minds, no matter how brilliant. The evolutionary character of spontaneous order also explains its adaptive superiority. Markets continuously adjust to changing conditions through the independent responses of countless participants. When oil becomes scarcer, prices rise automatically, encouraging conservation and alternative energy development without any central directive. When consumers' preferences change, producers respond immediately through price signals. Designed systems require conscious redesign to adapt, which explains why planned economies fell further behind market economies over time. The planners couldn't redesign their systems fast enough to keep pace with changing circumstances, while markets adapted automatically through the spontaneous responses of participants. Understanding this distinction reveals why attempts to improve markets through central direction often backfire. They replace spontaneous coordination with designed coordination, substituting the limited intelligence of planners for the unlimited intelligence of the market process. Chapter 3: The Price System as Information Technology. The price system represents humanity's most sophisticated information technology, more advanced than the internet, more efficient than any computer network ever built. Prices don't just reflect supply and demand, they solve the impossible problem of communicating relevant information to millions of decision-makers simultaneously. Every price contains a compressed summary of all relevant information about that good or service. When copper prices rise, they communicate that copper has become relatively scarcer, perhaps because of increased demand from electronics manufacturers, perhaps because of supply disruptions from mining regions, perhaps because of currency fluctuations affecting international trade. The beauty is that users of this information don't need to know why copper is scarcer, they only need to know that it is, so they can adjust their behavior accordingly. This information function of prices becomes clear when we observe how quickly markets respond to changes in underlying conditions. When a hurricane threatens oil refineries in the Gulf of Mexico, gasoline prices begin rising before the storm even makes landfall. The price system is communicating the increased probability of supply disruption, encouraging conservation and alternative planning. No central information bureau could disseminate this information as quickly or as effectively. Take a moment to observe how prices in your local grocery store respond to changing conditions. When California experiences drought, lettuce prices rise nationwide, encouraging consumers to substitute other vegetables and signaling farmers in other regions to increase lettuce production. When new technology reduces manufacturing costs, prices fall, making products accessible to more consumers and encouraging increased consumption. Each price change represents millions of calculations performed automatically by the market process. The mathematical elegance of price formation reveals itself in how markets handle complexity that would overwhelm any planning system. Consider how the price of a smartphone incorporates information about rare earth mining in Africa, semiconductor manufacturing in Asia, software development in California, transportation costs, currency exchange rates, consumer preferences, technological advancement, and competitive pressures. No single mind could process all these variables, yet markets synthesize them effortlessly into a single number that guides production and consumption decisions. This informational function explains why price controls inevitably create shortages and surpluses. When governments fix prices below market levels, they break the communication system that normally signals scarcity to consumers and profitability to producers. The information that would normally coordinate supply and demand gets suppressed, leading to the coordination failures we observe in controlled economies. The price system also demonstrates how markets create knowledge rather than just transmitting it. Through competitive bidding, entrepreneurial experimentation, and consumer choice, markets discover information that didn't previously exist. What should a new technology cost? How much are consumers willing to pay for convenience? Which production methods work most efficiently? Markets answer these questions through the discovery process of voluntary exchange. Modern digital technologies provide new examples of spontaneous price formation. Cryptocurrency markets operate 24/7 across global networks, with prices adjusting instantly to new information. Ride-sharing platforms use dynamic pricing to coordinate supply and demand in real time. Online marketplaces allow millions of buyers and sellers to discover prices for virtually anything. These systems work precisely because they harness the same principles that make traditional markets function: dispersed information, voluntary exchange, and the price mechanism as an information processing system. Chapter 4: The Fatal Conceit of Central Planning. The persistent belief that human reason can improve upon spontaneous market coordination represents what I call the fatal conceit, the arrogant assumption that what the human mind has designed is necessarily superior to what has evolved without design. This intellectual error underlies most economic policy mistakes and explains why well-intentioned interventions often produce results opposite to those intended. The fatal conceit manifests in the belief that because humans can understand individual market transactions, they can therefore design better systems for coordinating all market activity. This is like assuming that because we understand how individual neurons work, we can design a better brain. The complexity that emerges from simple interactions exceeds the comprehension of any designing mind. Central planners invariably underestimate the knowledge problem they're attempting to solve. They see the orderly patterns of market coordination and assume these patterns result from conscious design rather than evolutionary development. Observing that markets sometimes produce outcomes they dislike, they conclude that deliberate planning could produce better results. They fail to recognize that the alternatives they imagine are not alternatives to market imperfections, but alternatives to market coordination itself. The intellectual hubris becomes apparent when we examine specific planning failures. Soviet planners, despite accessing vast resources and employing thousands of economists, consistently produced goods that consumers didn't want while failing to produce goods they desperately needed. Venezuelan price controls created shortages of basic necessities while black markets flourished. Each failure followed the same pattern. Planners substituted their limited knowledge for the vast knowledge coordinated by market processes. Modern manifestations of the fatal conceit appear in regulatory attempts to improve market outcomes. Environmental regulations that ban efficient technologies in favor of politically preferred alternatives. Housing policies that restrict supply while demanding affordable prices. Healthcare systems that suppress price signals while expecting efficient resource allocation. Financial regulations that attempt to eliminate risk while creating systemic instabilities. The conceit becomes fatal because it systematically destroys the information systems that make coordination possible. When planners replace market prices with administered prices, they eliminate the signals that guide production and consumption decisions. When they substitute regulatory commands for voluntary exchange, they break the feedback mechanisms that allow systems to self-correct. When they centralize decisions that markets handle through dispersed knowledge, they create coordination problems that cannot be solved through more planning. The seductive appeal of central planning stems from its promise to achieve conscious purposes through deliberate design. But this appeal rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of how complex systems function. The order we observe in market economies didn't arise because someone planned it. It arose because evolutionary processes selected arrangements that work better than their alternatives. Recognizing the fatal conceit doesn't mean accepting whatever outcomes markets produce. It means understanding that improvements must work with spontaneous order rather than against it. We can establish better rules within which markets operate, stronger property rights, more efficient legal systems, clearer information requirements. But we cannot replace the market coordination process with something designed by human reason. The tragedy of the fatal conceit is that it prevents societies from benefiting from the accumulated wisdom embedded in their evolved institutions. Instead of learning from the solutions that spontaneous processes have discovered, planners attempt to substitute their own designs, thereby destroying the very mechanisms that created prosperity in the first place. Chapter 5: How Institutions Evolved to Support Cooperation. The institutions that enable market coordination, property rights, contract law, monetary systems, commercial customs, didn't emerge through conscious design but through evolutionary processes that selected arrangements promoting successful cooperation. Understanding this evolutionary development reveals why effective institutions cannot be simply transplanted from one society to another or rapidly created through legislative decree. Property rights exemplify how institutions evolved to solve coordination problems. Early human societies discovered that individual ownership of resources reduced conflicts and encouraged productive effort. Communities that developed clearer property rules outcompete those with ambiguous ownership, not because anyone planned this outcome, but because better defined property rights enabled more effective resource allocation. Over generations, legal systems refined these rules, creating the sophisticated property law that modern market economies require. Contract law evolved similarly through accumulated judicial decisions responding to commercial disputes. Merchants needed reliable ways to coordinate complex exchanges across time and distance. Common law judges, resolving individual cases, gradually developed principles that reduced transaction costs and increased commercial reliability. No legislator designed these principles. They emerged through the competitive selection of legal rules that facilitated beneficial exchange. Monetary institutions demonstrate evolutionary development particularly clearly. Money emerged spontaneously as certain commodities proved superior for indirect exchange, more durable, divisible, and widely accepted than alternatives. Gold and silver became monetary standards not through government decree but through market processes that selected the most effective exchange media. Even modern central banking evolved from competitive banking systems, though government monopolization has unfortunately disrupted this evolutionary process. The evolutionary character of institutions explains why attempts to rapidly transplant institutional frameworks often fail. The institutions that work effectively in established market economies developed gradually through trial and error, cultural adaptation, and the accumulation of social capital. Simply copying the formal rules while ignoring the informal practices, social norms, and cultural understanding that make these rules effective produces institutional facades without functional substance. Consider how attempts to establish market economies in post-communist societies encountered unexpected difficulties. The formal institutions, stock markets, commercial law, regulatory agencies, could be created relatively quickly. But the informal institutions, business ethics, commercial trust, entrepreneurial customs, required longer development through actual market experience. Without these supporting elements, The formal institutions often functioned poorly or became vehicles for corruption rather than productive exchange. This evolutionary perspective has profound implications for institutional reform. Effective changes must build upon existing institutional foundations rather than attempting wholesale replacement. Successful reforms typically involve gradual modification of existing arrangements rather than revolutionary redesign. They work with social forces rather than against them, harnessing evolutionary pressures rather than attempting to override them. Take a moment to observe how institutions continue evolving in contemporary markets. Digital platforms develop reputation systems that enable trust between strangers. Cryptocurrency networks experiment with new monetary arrangements. Online marketplaces create novel dispute resolution mechanisms. These innovations succeed when they solve real coordination problems and fail when they ignore evolutionary constraints. The lesson for policymakers is humility about their ability to design better institutions through deliberate planning. The institutions that enable market coordination represent accumulated wisdom from millions of individual experiments in cooperation. They embody solutions to coordination problems that no single mind could solve through pure reason. Preserving space for institutional evolution while preventing its disruption through misguided intervention becomes the crucial task for maintaining prosperous societies. Chapter 6: The Connection Between Freedom and Spontaneous Order. Individual liberty and spontaneous order are not merely compatible, they are mutually dependent. Freedom enables the experimentation and voluntary cooperation that generates spontaneous order, while spontaneous order creates the coordination that makes freedom practically possible. Understanding this connection reveals why protecting individual liberty serves not just moral purposes but functional necessities for prosperous societies. Freedom makes spontaneous order possible by protecting the space for individual initiative and voluntary association. When people can choose their occupations, form businesses, enter contracts, and pursue their own purposes, they automatically contribute to the vast coordination process we call the market economy. Each person's pursuit of their individual goals, constrained by others' equal rights, generates the network of voluntary exchanges that spontaneously coordinates social cooperation. This coordination function of freedom becomes apparent when we observe how restrictions on liberty disrupt spontaneous order. When governments control occupational choices, they prevent the labor mobility that allows markets to allocate human resources efficiently. When they restrict business formation, they eliminate the entrepreneurial experimentation that drives innovation and adaptation. When they control prices, they destroy the information system that coordinates supply and demand. The American constitutional tradition demonstrates how legal frameworks can protect the conditions for spontaneous order. The Constitution's protection of property rights, contract freedom, and interstate commerce created institutional space for market development. The federal system allowed different states to experiment with different approaches, enabling evolutionary selection of effective institutions. The separation of powers prevented any single authority from controlling the entire coordination process. But spontaneous order also makes freedom practically possible by solving the coordination problems that otherwise require authoritarian direction. When markets coordinate economic activity voluntarily, societies don't need central planners with coercive power over individual choices. When social cooperation emerges through mutual benefit rather than command, authorities don't need extensive control over personal behavior. This reciprocal relationship explains why free societies tend to be prosperous and why prosperous societies tend to remain free. Freedom enables the spontaneous coordination that creates wealth, while prosperity provides the resources and opportunities that make freedom valuable to individuals. Societies that restrict freedom handicap their coordination mechanisms and thereby reduce their prosperity. Poor societies often sacrifice freedom for promised coordination that central authorities cannot actually deliver. The connection also reveals why threats to economic freedom inevitably become threats to personal freedom. Economic coordination requires countless individual decisions about production, consumption, investment, and employment. When authorities control these economic decisions, they necessarily control the personal choices that determine how individuals live their lives. There is no clear boundary between economic planning and personal planning because all human action involves resource allocation across time. Consider how contemporary policy debates often miss this connection. Regulations intended to improve market outcomes frequently require restricting individual choice. Healthcare mandates limit personal decisions about medical care. Environmental policies restrict property use. Financial regulations control investment options. Each restriction, however well-intentioned, reduces the space for spontaneous coordination and thereby requires more authoritarian direction to achieve social goals. The practical implication is that protecting freedom requires protecting spontaneous order, and protecting spontaneous order requires protecting freedom. We cannot preserve individual liberty while destroying the market institutions that make voluntary coordination possible. Nor can we maintain effective market coordination while eliminating the individual freedoms that enable voluntary cooperation. This understanding provides a framework for evaluating policy proposals. Do they expand or contract the space for voluntary cooperation? Do they enhance or diminish the spontaneous coordination that makes both freedom and prosperity possible? The answers to these questions should guide our choices about the institutional arrangements that will determine our society's future. Chapter 7: Spontaneous Order in the Digital Age. The digital revolution provides the most spectacular contemporary demonstration of spontaneous order principles, creating complex coordination systems that no central authority designed or controls. From the Internet's architecture to cryptocurrency networks to social media platforms, digital technologies show how voluntary cooperation can generate sophisticated order without hierarchical planning. The Internet itself exemplifies spontaneous order. No central authority designed its structure or controls its development. Instead, it emerged through voluntary adoption of technical standards that enable universal connectivity. The protocols that allow any computer to communicate with any other computer worldwide developed through collaborative processes among engineers and researchers, not through government mandate or corporate planning. Consider how online marketplaces coordinate millions of buyers and sellers without central direction. Amazon, eBay, and similar platforms provide frameworks for voluntary exchange, but they don't determine what gets sold, at what prices, or to whom. Market participants make these decisions independently, guided by the same price signals and profit opportunities that coordinate traditional markets. The result is a coordination system more vast and responsive than any traditional marketplace ever achieved. Cryptocurrency networks demonstrate spontaneous monetary order emerging through voluntary adoption rather than government decree. Bitcoin operates without central banking authorities, yet maintains monetary stability through algorithmic rules and voluntary participation. Users choose to hold and exchange Bitcoin because they find it useful for their purposes, not because any authority compels its use. The network's security and reliability emerged through the distributed cooperation of participants worldwide. Digital labor markets show how technology can reduce coordination costs while preserving spontaneous order principles. Platforms like Uber and Airbnb enable complex resource allocation, matching drivers with passengers, hosts with guests, through applications that facilitate voluntary exchange. No central planner determines which drivers work when or which properties get rented. These decisions emerge through the same market processes that coordinate traditional economic activity, but with dramatically reduced transaction costs. Social media platforms reveal how information networks develop spontaneously through voluntary participation. No authority designed Twitter's trending topics, Reddit's community moderation, or YouTube's recommendation algorithms in their current forms. These systems evolve through user behavior, platform responses, and competitive adaptation. They demonstrate how complex information processing can emerge from simple rules governing voluntary interaction. The challenges facing digital platforms also illustrate the dangers of abandoning spontaneous order principles. When platforms attempt to control content through centralized moderation rather than community self-regulation, they often create coordination problems they cannot solve effectively. When they substitute algorithmic manipulation for user choice, they undermine the voluntary cooperation that made their platforms valuable initially. Contemporary policy debates about digital regulation often miss these spontaneous order insights. Proposals to break up tech companies assume that coordination requires concentrated control rather than distributed cooperation. Attempts to regulate algorithm design ignore how these systems evolve through competitive adaptation rather than deliberate planning. Efforts to control online speech substitute administrative judgment for the community processes that traditionally govern social coordination. The cryptocurrency revolution particularly demonstrates how spontaneous order can challenge existing institutional arrangements. Central bank digital currencies attempt to preserve government monetary control while adopting digital technology. But they miss the essential insight that cryptocurrency's value comes not from digital efficiency but from spontaneous order principles, voluntary adoption, decentralized control, and market-determined value. Understanding spontaneous order principles provides guidance for digital policy that preserves innovation while addressing legitimate concerns. Rather than attempting to control digital coordination through central direction, we can establish frameworks that protect voluntary cooperation while preventing fraud and coercion. Rather than replacing market mechanisms with administrative rules, we can strengthen the institutions that enable spontaneous digital order to flourish. The digital age confirms that spontaneous order remains humanity's most powerful coordination mechanism, even as technology transforms how that coordination occurs. The challenge is preserving space for voluntary cooperation while adapting our institutions to digital realities. Conclusion. Markets work like magic not because they violate natural laws, but because they harness principles of coordination that transcend individual human intelligence. The apparent magic dissolves when we understand that complex order can emerge without conscious design, that information can be processed without central collection, and that cooperation can develop without authoritarian direction. The knowledge embedded in spontaneous market coordination represents centuries of human experimentation in voluntary cooperation. Price systems, property rights, contract law, and competitive markets evolved because they solved coordination problems better than available alternatives. They work precisely because they don't require anyone to possess complete knowledge or exercise comprehensive control. This understanding carries profound responsibilities for those who would preserve and extend human prosperity. We must resist the fatal conceit that human reason can improve upon evolved coordination mechanisms. We must protect the institutional frameworks that enable spontaneous order while avoiding interventions that destroy the very mechanisms we seek to improve. The digital age offers new opportunities to apply spontaneous order principles while creating new challenges for their preservation. The same forces that enable incredible coordination through voluntary cooperation online also enable unprecedented concentration of control that could undermine that cooperation. The choice before us is not between perfect markets and perfect planning, neither exists. The choice is between coordination through voluntary cooperation and coordination through coercive control, between systems that harness dispersed knowledge and systems that suppress it, between institutions that evolve and institutions that ossify. Understanding why markets work like magic, and why they aren't magical, provides the intellectual foundation for choices that will determine whether future generations inherit the prosperity that spontaneous order has created.